I hope you can. Okay, the up on top, wanted to kind of at least mention Rob Edwards, who passed this year, and who these are sort of remind me of him. When I first came to California to start teaching at Foothill College, he was a great resource, and I would call him up out of the blue and ask him questions about what I was doing at Foothill College, and he was always super helpful. So we're always sort of on the shoulders of giants, and he was one of them in the area. So I wanted to acknowledge Rob and his meaningfulness to this community as well. So thank you, Rob, wherever you are, for everything. Moving forward, okay, let's kind of give maybe a little bit of background onto what I'm thinking or why I'm struggling with this. Okay, so when I start these classes, cut it anytime, but when I start these classes that I teach, when I teach archaeology, I always kind of bring up this thing I call the vision problem. And it's that archaeology has this real difficulty portraying itself to the general public who think this, who think indie, and then archaeologists counter that or react to that by being very scientific and trying to prove that they are not that. And then they end up being, and this is my opinion, end up being so scientific that they're utterly boring, right? And if you ask somebody, if somebody asks an archaeologist about what they do, generally the eyes glaze over. If you're an archaeologist, you know the feeling. It's the worst. You're trying to be excited about something, and they just want to know what you found. They want to know what indie-like adventure you've had. You can't do it, right? And so that chasm between these two, I think, has been a real struggle for archaeologists. And so I propose this to my students as we try to think about kind of what other sciences do well. Astronomy. Astronomy, we all know that those are smart scientists. They'll talk about astronomy stuff and you'll be like, oh, that's really cool. I don't think they have lightsabers. I don't think they can fly, that they can beam you up, Scotty, and all that stuff, right? So I know what an astronomer does. I know the fantasy of it. I do not get that in archaeology for some reason, right? So what's missing? Why have we screwed up? Or what can we do to fix that? Is kind of the way I pose it to kind of first-timer students. My first archaeology class was utterly boring because it was trying to be very scientific. I remember that. And so that's the kind of thing I'm trying to get at. And then, so what were the reactions to that? Is there a future? Yes, there is. There's a future at the end of the rainbow, and it's in Hawaii on the Big Island with me and Mike, okay? But we'll get there. And so our paper is kind of discussions on how this gets solved. Or at least how we're trying to address it, would you say? Cut in, please. So first off, like what are things that archaeologists or our students are doing now? They're doing applied programs where they're trying to solve real world problems, come up with solutions using their anthropological archaeological background. San Jose State, NAU, out in Flag, those are really good programs. You can get a master's in that. Those of you who are students, think about that. But what this runs up against a lot, I think, is kind of it's taken lightly. It's not as serious by scholarship. It seems less academic. It doesn't have research designs in the same way, perhaps. And so that, I think, doesn't have as much legitimacy, I say, in the minds of archaeologists. And so that ends up being an issue. But I think it's really important, right? See, and I'm going fast. I apologize, everybody, but I got a lot of slides. Okay, and I'm assuming some little bit of level of knowledge of the people in front of me, and that's who I care about, the people in front of me. I do love you out there, but not as much as the people in front of me. Okay, so the CPBR is this idea of community-based public, or excuse me, participatory research, right? And this, Sonia Adelaide and many others, in the last decade, a little bit more, have really been talking about how you get the community involved in the research. You ask them first. They collaborate with you. You maybe even have them drive the research in some way. You're learning together, and you're decolonizing the Western kind of scientific framework that has really kind of overtaken, I think, in a lot of ways, archaeologists, right? And so that CPBR, that's being done not only in archaeology, it's being done in lots of different fields, and it's super cool. And so that's another thing I think that we can see out there that's being done with moderate success, I would say. So we know students are, when we have them, that they value learning scientific method, but within milieu of doing service projects, doing something for the public good, that this generation that's coming up, that's what they all want, okay? And so how do we kind of, in our minds, balance that? And this is in Hawaii on a lo'i or a kalo or taro pond where they're growing taro, and you can see at the bottom. And we're helping, the students are helping weed it. So a couple cool books that I think you should read. One of them, everybody's probably heard about this one already, The Dawn of Everything. And the reason I have this up here, Mike was like, why do we have that book up there? Like this idea of what they're talking about here is that all of the Western kind of framework has created science, right? A paradigm of science that then we're all within and we're all using to kind of justify civilization and the westernization of the world. So no matter what we do, however we interpret any culture in the past, we are creating a framework of a Western conceptualization, which is a colonial conceptualization. So is there a way to look at other kinds of sciences? Is there a way to think about non-Western science, right? And this is a really cool book that I just started reading, but it's actually quite, it's been around, but it's getting into the parlance a lot more on this idea of braiding. And this woman, Wal Kimmerer, she's an ecologist with a PhD, but she grew up as a Native American and in the northern Midwest, connected to the land, connected to the stories of her people. And she then slowly forgot that and became a PhD and became much more distant and colonial in her thinking, as she had to name everything and became objective and think of how research design is supposed to be for a scientist. So she becomes that, and then she realizes, oh, I have forgotten, and I want to go back to the way my people have thought about pecans and strawberries. And she does it all within this beautiful stories. Each chapter is this amazing story. It's just a great book. And that relationship is what we'll call braiding, like this mixing of the Western and the non-Western sciences together, the knowledges together, right? And so this is kind of, I think, been very significant going forward. And you have right here at Kurosti Valley in Big Basin Park, you have the work that Chuck Strickland and Kent Lakewood and all those people have been doing up there, Mark Helkema, of course, have been working on in that area, but looking at managed landscapes of Native groups have done that with the Amamudzen. So this is being done. It's nothing new. How do we do it with students in some way, right? And then there's this guy who I had met, and then I finally started reading his work and talking to him more intellectually about it, and I was blown away. And so that's why I brought Mike. I wanted Mike to start talking about how this kind of wraps into a lot of that. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. So what we've kind of come to understand is when we try and pull these two different approaches to the past together, there are tensions that we have to pay attention to between how Native people or Indigenous people, local people use and view these landscapes and features and the archaeology of their heritage, and the way that scientists approach those things. So I would support the idea that archaeology has a science fixation, has in the past, beginning probably in the 1970s, probably until now for sure. In that, I think the kind of dawn of scientific archaeology was an attempt to legitimize the work that we're doing, and is that it's not merely collecting beautiful things from parts all over the world. We're not arguing that science doesn't have a place in this, but what we found is that when we bring people in conversation with researchers about the things that they're interested in, we uncover a whole different kind of archaeology that's better, that's more nuanced, that has more layers to it. And the example of this is the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. So this is a story about this event that happened in the Southwest. It's the most successful indigenous rebellion in the Americas. It's the only time Spanish colonists were expelled from a large area, a colony, for a long period of time, for 12 years. And when they returned, the relationship between Native people and colonists was different. It was there. If you go to New Mexico today and you wonder, wow, there's a lot of big reservations here, that's probably why, because they were able to assert some kind of control over that space. But what's interesting is that when we tried to figure out, like, how did Pueblo identity form, and why is this particular site called Old Cochiti so important, is because it wasn't really valued by archaeologists. It was part of historical archaeology, and people don't really think that's super interesting. But when we asked the tribe, what do you want to have done in these spaces, they would like us to use these sites, these villages, and these locations to tell the story of their identity. And that's the thread that we see running through all of these projects is that once you open that conversation up, you don't get a reduction in what scientists can do. You get a different perspective on what the meaning of these places are. So in each one of these places we're working in, we're going to see a site that would probably look different to a specific kind of scientific archaeology point of view. And then once you introduce historical context, cultural context, and open the door for those discussions, boy, something different happens that's very unique that wasn't there before. So Old Kochi is the place where Pueblo identity was established. You would never know that by looking at it. It's just an old village where it's the walls are crumbling down. And if you ask the people who live and manage those spaces now, you learn about the importance of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. So this is just an example. So when I do work, I want to start off with contemporary people. I want to understand not how people disappeared from archaeological sites, how they vanished, which is the main narrative of Native peoples all over the world, is that we're a vanishing people, vanishing for 500 years, so go figure. But if you start from the present day and then work your way back, you are led to a different set of assumptions. One would be the most important, I think, is how do we explain what Native people are still doing in these spaces? Like, what's the story that makes that connection visible? Can archaeology speak to those kinds of questions? And I think we can. So the questions that the phenomenon I want to understand is how do Native people, Indigenous peoples look at these spaces now when we change the framework a little bit and allow that conversation to take place? So I'm turn it back over to Sam.
No, this is the grant.
Oh, okay, great. So is this just like pie in the sky stuff? No, it isn't. In recent years, researchers who want to work, especially archaeologists who want to work in spaces, Indigenous communities, you have to negotiate access to those spaces. And it's different now than it was 20, 30 years ago. Not only is it just something you have to do, but the newer generation of archaeologists are really interested in this collaborative work that's possible. So there's an NSF grant that Sonia Adelaide and a couple of other people, Aura Martinez, I think is her name. I'm blanking on it. But they created this NSF grant proposal that would bring together Native communities from all around the country who are interested in blending these approaches to Indigenous community scientific problems by blending these two things together and braiding those two kind of worldviews together. So CBIX is like they're creating these centers around different parts of the country where Indigenous peoples can collaborate and work on problems like water quality or food systems or sustainability in communities or food deserts or any number of things that are of great importance to Native people. So just for context, last year the Bureau of Indian Affairs identified two main troubles, two main things that it was going to have to address for Native people in the next 100 years, next century. And food security is a big one, huge. How are you going to feed people in these spaces? And climate change, because they're impacting communities of color disproportionately, and Native communities are a part of that too. So you start working on archaeological sites, and then the questions you have, everything kind of mushrooms into these larger questions and engagements that you can put together. So the grant came through. We just got it a couple days ago, and it's going to facilitate these kinds of conversations. So I'll turn it over to Sam.
Well, yeah, and so kind of what we were discussing before we came in was, so on each of these projects, then how successful are they at doing what we've been talking about here, and in what degree can they change? Where could they go with this? It's kind of how I want to frame this, right? So we'll start in Ecuador, where I've been working with my wife for 20 years, and studying colonialism, studying the conquest of the area. This is north of Quito in the highlands, the conquest of the area by the Inca, and then subsequently, less than 100 years later, by the Spanish. So it's like a double colonialism and a double resistance that we're interested in. This is a classic project, right, where you had the Inca and the Spanish, and then you had the localized indigenous local Cayambe peoples, the Ecuadorians resisting, large fortresses being built, a lot of excellent archaeology in the traditional sense, with major archaeological, architectural, exposures, funding by the Fulbright and the NSF, the U.S. ambassadors, field school programs that were coming in, and they're experiencing the culture of Highland Ecuador. And is that enough? Can we change the narrative going forward? 20 years down the line, we have a lab, a storage for of artifacts that's half the size of this room. Maybe we don't really need to be excavating anymore. What are the next steps as we think about lab work and as we think about community-based research projects, right? We are paying lip service, but the research design, right, always has public kind of outreach at the end. What if we inform, what if we sort of change and braid knowledges, right? This is a picture of Inti Raymi festivals, which happen right when we arrive every time in the end of June in the little village where we live. And it is just a panoply of color. And if you're trying to interpret that, good luck. Confusion is what I would say is what's going on here culturally. What are these symbols mean? And it was something that we enjoyed, something that we take part in, we observe, but we're not knowing about it. Nobody's really been talking and finding out all the intricacies to, why are there peacock feathers in your hat? To something that basic to why you're dancing, how the dances are happening, and the entire process of it is not really being investigated or talked with them about. So I'd love to be able to think that in the future, we can understand that in some way, and then that would inform us going forward, right? But during that time, we are probably hauling shovels up a mountain to excavate things, right? So we are away from that. When in fact, we're kind of almost, I remember conversations going, God, these parties keep going. The natives are continuing to dance. We have nobody to work for us. You think a complete mindset shift has to take place where you're sort of thinking, why are we here? We're sort of here with a colonial mindset to do research, to take things from you. And where are you? That kind of thing. There's endless examples I could come up with. You go up to the top of the mountains. This is a high grasslands. The students are getting a tour here at the beginning. And this is one of the large fortresses called Quitoloma. It was likely built, we think, by the Inca. And that's important. I mean, we did have contributed in importance of scientific, historical knowledge. It's built by the Inca in order to try to control access routes to the Amazon and to dominate the area. This was last summer. It hasn't changed in 20 years since we've been there, but if you do notice, there's a little exposure and has been cleaned above their heads there, the students' heads. And that's what I want to call attention to. The local community is upkeeping this place and is preparing for, at some point, tourism, which hasn't arrived, but they are creating and they are motivating on their own to continue upkeep. They're not bringing cows through here. They're not allowing it to get destroyed. So they're making a conscious decision. The community is. And so this year, my colleague, Anna, and then our other colleague, Zev at American University, Zev Kosin, decided to go full CPBR, full community participation. We're not going to excavate at all. We're going to do some lab work, like I said. So this is the lab work for the students. And then other than that, we are not going to be doing this, no excavation. So the students were aware of that. This is a field school with no excavations. But other things, survey and lab work, we're not going to be on top of some big pyramid digging it. We're going to be at a flower farm, and we're going to be studying why they are growing flowers here, how this is involved in the world economy, who's working at this flower farm, the greater dynamics of the global markets in this case. And with this trip here, and in talking to the ex-mayor of the town and peppering him with questions about everything. Similarly, if there are little local museums that the town I mentioned, the little village up at the top of the mountain is interested in kind of showing, and they're very proud. They show proudly their pictures of them cleaning the architecture of the Inca architecture. Beyond that, so we asked them, what would you like us to do? What would you want us to do? What research how can we be involved more? And so we've already cleaned this. What we'd like you now is to make a bunch of signs with numbers on them, announcing what each location is. And so produce these signs for us, and then give us a detailed description of what every location is, and we need that within a week. Okay, so the students are on it. Their students are frantically writing all this stuff in Spanish, and they're trying to get it all organized. And here is the final, implantation of one of the signs at the great entrance. And they're excited. They're going through they're practicing what they're going to say when the tourists come to that location. Yeah, and she is proudly wearing her blue jacket, which is the other thing they asked for. They all wanted similar jackets that had an emblem with the map we drew of this that we created of the site, they wanted the map right here. And if you can kind of see it, she has the map right there. So and I think it's on the back too, isn't it?
Tour guides.
And it says tour guides.
It's for the tour guides.
It's just for the tour guides, yes. And they're really excited. So that was what they wanted. And it's not like, hey, we can't put, we don't think that. No, this is what they wanted. This is the conversation starting. It's kind of almost renewing the conversation. It's a 20-year conversation. So this woman was probably 5 years old and running around with her mom the first time she met me. These guys were, young teenagers, and now they're the president of the community. So we've been there long enough, but never bonded enough, I would argue, from my perspective, because I was coming in, I think, maybe doing it wrong, doing it differently than what we've been talking about. And we want to shift that going forward in South America and Ecuador, right? So the students did small cursos vacacionales, summer camp type things with the local kids, making doing different projects and things like that. That was very successful. That's what they wanted. They wanted us to help with kind of training the kids in a little bit of English, etc. So that's their field school. That's their archaeology field school, and everybody's thrilled. It works kind of in smaller groups. I would argue next steps. You can't have too big of a field school. We wrestle with this in Hawaii, as you're going to see as well. You want to have a certain amount of students to come because you're kind of funding with that, and you want to give as many people as experience. Also, my college wants a certain amount of students in a class, but it really works the best with smaller groups. So maybe you bring smaller groups, and maybe you just insist that everybody can speak Spanish, especially here. I don't know. There's things that we have to discuss. If we're going to go this route, maybe everybody has to speak Spanish because it's really difficult for them to kind of communicate. These are decisions we have to think about as we try to make sense of this mass of people and what's going on. And in the future, when this guy asks us to be here, he wonders why we're there, we have a good reason. And we can kind of make that connection that we're hoping to. Okay, I'm now going to shift you to another world, another project, right? Which is completely different. And this is in Ireland, where we also study colonialism, but we are there seeing the real manifestation of a successful resistance to a colonialism that was taking place for 800 years. To the right, the east of Ireland, there's a larger country. They call it England. And then that I should be over here from your perspective, that country invaded quite some time ago, invaded Ireland and colonized them. And were rather brutal to that country. So in this story of archaeology, our community-based research, participatory research, has more become community, county, and nation-state driven research, with as in a sense that the mission of archaeology kind of has overtaken us there. Like completely the opposite of the Ecuador experience. There, I feel like I'm being led along all the way, and that I'm a guest in this country, and I'm doing exactly what they want me to do. That's perhaps because archaeology is this super respected thing. There, it's vital for increasing their identity. This kind of Gaelic nationalism that's there. This magazine, which we were featured in a couple of years ago, it's kind of like their National Geographic. It's for sale in the airport. It's everywhere. So like archaeology is big there. It has managed much differently. I don't think they have the vision problem there. It's much more in the current. Everybody can talk about and is knowledgeable about a lot of the most recent things that were found and all that. So our project is called Castles and Communities, and we study in this place called Ballintober. But it consciously was called Castles and Communities by ourselves and our Irish counterpart. This is the castle. It's the Ballintober Castle, which is in Central Ireland. Ireland is, it's just an amazing place to work. I mean, to be. See the coast, this beautiful old architecture, tourists flock to all these areas. They do not go where we are. We are in Iowa of Ireland. We are in Kansas. Like somebody comes to the US and they tell you they're going to Iowa for vacation and they come all the way to the US, you would be like, why are you going there? That's what people do when we see them in Ireland. They are shocked that we work here. They have no idea why we want to be there. Well, we're there because we love cows, which is all there are there. But to be frank, it's because it's one of these main locations where there was a lot of resistance in the past, but that's not really why we went. We went because we were invited by a scholar. there are two reasons to stop in this little town: the stop sign and the pubs. And the pubs are kind of the central focus of these communities. There's two in our little town. There's no pretext of kind of being tourist-like in this place. There's no, my colleague, Neo Brady, who we work with, he calls it sham crockery. There's none of that. It's all just folks living, farmers mostly. I'm surprised we don't see 3 or 4 tractors out front. Everybody drives a tractor, and they're huge wheels. You have to be very careful when you're driving, because these guys are bombing around on their tractors everywhere. But the town is happy to have us. They welcome us to the town, to the project. All these local dignitaries come out, speak. The local band plays the Star Spangled Banner for us in front of the castle, and this is where most of the excavations are taking place right now, right up on the top there. There's folk music, there's dance lessons that are organized for us. There are maybe 2 or 3 of these kinds of talks a week, which we have to go to. And like the ancient horns of Ireland, like this guy's playing horns, and everybody's like, we've been working all day. Nope, we're going to the ancient horns of Ireland because they want us to do it. And so our whole we are hosted as guests, and it's very regimented, and it's being it's being dictated by this organization called the Tidy Towns. And the Tidy Towns in Ireland are these kind of organizations that keep everything prim and proper in their little villages. So we are kind of the co-leads, but maybe the secondary leads of this community participation, I'd say. This is all the stuff I was just talking about. Just want to make sure. They also rearranged their Heritage Week. They have a national Heritage Week, but this town switched it to another week, so it's when we're there. And then they made a bunch of little things that we had to go to within that Heritage Week. When we were there, the U.S. ambassador came. They were just shocked that there were 60 Americans in the middle of nowhere in Ireland, and they didn't know why. So they wanted to come see it. He wanted to come see it with his wife. There's lots of participation with local governments, and tourism is in the background as a thing that they want to promote, but it's not really organized like that. It's more, we were talking about it. It's more there's something else going on here. There's something behind the story that we were exploring that's important. So what's the story of the castle, real quick? Story of the castle is you have the Anglo-Normans, the British, invading from the southeast through Leinster in 1171. And through some circumstances, they sort of drove through Dublin and then got to about where those arrows are, the orange arrows are, and they stopped. And then everything else was what they called beyond the pale. And they would eventually try to conquer Connacht, but that area became really rebellious, the area that was in brown. And that area was controlled, and the leader of that was the O'Connor clan. And Rory O'Connor was the last High King of Ireland, and they're rotating leadership at that point in Ireland. And he was the last king, and he was this resistant leader. And it turns out that Mike's family is O'Connor. So when he came and visited, he was talking. They were like, "Oh yes, this is your ancestor." So we're going to find out a little bit about Mike's family. So at about wait, did I say everything on the last slide? Yeah, at about and so here we are inside this castle, and Neil Brady, our co-director, the PI, the one who gets the permit, the Irish archaeologist, is on the left-hand side, kind of walking into the picture. But the interesting thing about this castle is that he thinks it was built by the British, the Anglo-Normans, in order to subdue this recalcitrant, resisting population around him. That it was built by a guy named de Burgh, they think, in the early 1300s, maybe late 1200s, and during the Middle Ages. And it was quickly, within 30 years, overtaken by the O'Connors. So it was retaken by the Irish, and they never gave it back. They've owned it for 700 years. The O'Connors have owned it. And here is Piers O'Connor visiting his castle while we're working on it. So it's a completely different vibe when the owner of the castle, who's owned it for 700 years, shows up, and he's wondering what you're doing. How's this happening? What's going on? Super cool. Local farmers are talking with him. There's definitely a kind of a class difference. He has a big manor house. things like that. But there's this identity of Ireland that's just, it's very poignant when you meet somebody like that. So what happens? They requested Neil, and then he brought us on to research this castle more. They want to find out more about it. Where does it fit in the history of Ireland? He did a lot of scanning on the outside, and then we did a lot of radar. One of the things I do is ground penetrating radar with our students. We train them at Foothill to do this. So we set up a grid inside the castle, and there are several features that were found inside the castle. You can see those in red in the middle. And one of them I'll call your attention to that's kind of cool is the one in the middle top, which is kind of has abutments as you get down to about 60 centimeters below ground surface. It looks like nothing, it's just a field on the ground. But then below you have these abutments and a structure. And if you piece it together and you did point plots of kind of where the rocks were and you laid it on the ground, it looks like to all the world like a small chapel that would have been inside the castle that's now gone, or it was raised at some point. And it would have been in that location there. We had an artist kind of do a reconstruction of the castle at perhaps maybe in the 1500s or 1600s, when it was decidedly Catholic at that time and was resisting actively the British or the Anglo kind of colonial manorial estates they had and all that sort of. Think haciendas, think missions here, very similar there that they had with the Irish. Okay. But Neil actually is not interested in that at all. He's interested in the doorways, and that's where we're digging. He's interested in we're trying to find, using some of these early features in the corner he's looking for. And so he has to apply for a permit 6 months before. He has to give exact locations with UTM points, exactly where he's going to dig, and he cannot move, not change those digs. You can't just go say, I'm going to go dig over here. It's all controlled by the state. And in fact, everything is owned by the state in Ireland. And everything below, say, 30 centimeters is state owned, and you cannot go find anything. You can't metal detect and find something. You'll go to jail if you do that in Ireland. But everything in Ireland is known about. Like every archaeological site is on a website, archaeology.ie, and you can see every archaeology site in the whole country. And everybody knows where everything is, but nobody touches anything. So it's a completely different vibe in terms of how it's thought about, because it's part of their cultural patrimony and everybody's buying in. So it's totally different, right? And they've thrown off the shackles of the Anglo-Normans and the British, and they're able to do this, at least in the southern part. The little northern part, we've got some issues still, right? So here are the excavations of the castles are happening, troweling, students getting all that experience, exposed large, thick-walled structures, very thick with burning on the bottom. Maybe that burning is when this structure, which we think is Anglo-Norman, which is the British, was overtaken. So this might be the moment where that overtaking was happening. You can actually see below, down there, some of the earlier architecture, which might have been Gaelic. And so this is very nice Norman battered construction, a little bit tilting in with some earlier living surfaces that it covers. You can kind of see it there. That would be your earlier Gaelic surface, and then you have your British, and then your Anglo-Norman, excuse me, and then you have Ireland retaking it. And the students all kind of talking about it. So what we know so far is that you have these early Gaelic features, Anglo-Norman, and then later. Okay, what does this tell us about resistance? What does this tell us about this place, which is so important, which is where we're getting to? So last thing about surveying or thinking about the research we've done there with the students, we've taken them out to these big fields outside of the castle. So when we started, I was just like, gotta get these students doing something. They can't all fit in these excavation units. So and I asked whether it was okay if we started doing some surveys with the radar and with magnetometry. And Neil said, yes, that's fine. It's non-intrusive. We're allowed to do that in Ireland. So we started doing it in quads all around, squares. And we also used a gradiometer, which is like a magnetometer. And we started finding evidence of medieval house plots, which have a set size, and also a road, which is the white dotted line you guys see. And that road is kind of coming from the castle, as you see. It's going towards the castle. And there it is. There's the main street and the house plots. And those little other things are fire pits. Those darker black things are fire pits, which would have been in the middle of everybody's house. So we found the deserted medieval village. There's only been 4 or 5 found in the entire country of Ireland. So all of a sudden, we're on top. We're on the front of the magazine. We're like, whoa, we found something exciting that can talk about this moment in time when the settlers came and were colonizing, and then they disappeared. Or the plague probably hit. Something happened. So we've just recently been running dates, and it's fitting into what we call the late medieval times, in that 1300s or a little bit later, 1400s time period, but there's a range of dates. And here you can get the architecture then is been mapped by this guy named Andrew, who's getting his PhD at Harvard. And he's really interested in sort of mapping, seeing how much he can map and understand without being intrusive. And he's managed to do all these kind of tests that he can basically with just doing what are the things we drill down? Why am I blanking the name? Drill down. Yeah, augering. He's augering, and he'll auger only every so often, and he can be able to interpret what the architecture was. Very cool stuff that he's doing. And so this is sort of a similar types of the architecture, what it would look like. It's wattle and daub, sort of thatch with wattle and daub structure. So it's all melted away. What you see on the ground is this. And so we had all the students get in a line on the road. And so you're on the road, everybody. And so you're going to get a picture of the road. And so what is the town? The town is embracing this. My worry was that the guy who owns the land would be freaking out, because then all of a sudden this is patrimony. This is national patrimony. You're not going to be able to build anything here any longer. You have a medieval village underneath, and he's fine with it. So that's great. The town has embraced this. The town itself is now currently further south, which is really interesting. The main road, you can't really see it, is the gray that's kind of coming to the south of the castle. So the British or the Anglo-Norman settlement seems to have been abandoned, and then a new settlement, continuity of settlement has happened, but it has shifted further south. So we have a story of resistance. We have this kind of post-plague desertion. We have, or there seems to be in this location, a story of kind of Catholic resistance that has persisted for 700-800 years. And we started thinking that maybe that's the important touchdown, that the thing that where they're really headed with this, or what they want out of this. In terms of decolonizing archaeology, it's completely different, right? This is we're invited to be there. There's a native or an Irish archaeologist. I don't know if he'd want to be called native or indigenous Irishman, but that's what he is. He's from there, and he's invited us in as the permit holder. We're kind of being hosted, and everything's owned by the state. It's a completely different spectrum kind of what we saw, I think, in Ecuador, and how the students interact with it is completely different. What's kind of interesting then, if you go back and look, and like this was later on, you go back and look at their sign that they created for the castle, they insist that it was built by them, by the O'Connors, in 1300, which is not what any history book says. But the town has made their own sign, and they're claiming kind of ownership and construction and resistance for that, which is super cool. And that's kind of showing that contested history. I want to take this to language, and then into Hawaii. Okay, so what turns out is that the place where we work seems to be, or was, kind of the hotbed for the growth of the Gaelic language, the resurgence of the Gaelic language. This guy, Hyde, first president of Ireland, grew up right there, and his house is kind of a little museum that you can go to. And he was a champion of this revitalization. And so that identity, kind of that desire to kind of rekindle that identity, the case can be really made in Ireland that from the 40s on, that was a kind of a key element to a lot of this resurgence, that they started teaching it in schools. You can't get a job in Ireland with the government unless you speak fluent Gaelic. So if you want to get a job with the state, you have to speak it. So everybody goes and studies it. And so that then just created this mindset, I think, which has shifted the entire culture. And then archaeology then becomes part of that story. And you want to go into Hawaii there in that same vein with the language?
Yeah, so these connections are kind of interesting. Hawaii has, the parallels between Ireland and Hawaii are pretty interesting. If you were to go there, they look very similar. There's a lot of grasses, there's a lot of beautiful scenery, beautiful beaches in Ireland. People don't know that, but there are amazing beaches that are there too. But for the project I worked on, it was another kind of fortuitous thing that happened. I had a student who was doing an oral historical project about his grandfather, who was from the Big Island of Hawaii, He was a rancher, he was a Paniolo, which is a cowboy. And the student of mine, Noel, had an opportunity to interview him for his senior thesis project to talk about what life was like in the 1800s, early 20th century. So I was invited there to do this work, and the same thing kind of happened. We started to look at this land tract where his family had been from, this ranch, and we started to tell stories that were specifically tied to that place and that location. So in 1990, it's kind of a step back. Kamehameha Schools, which is kind of the reservation system for Hawaii, just a little back information. Hawaiian people don't have the same status as Native Americans in North America. They're not part of a tribe. They're a landless ethnic group, a landless tribal group. So same thing with California. About half of the tribes in California are landless. Very interesting that those parallels are there. Another thing that took place is when Kamehameha was the first king who united all the islands, and shortly thereafter, he invited missionaries to come and introduce this idea of literacy, universal literacy, to the Hawaiian people. So 4 or 5 Native Hawaiian people went to the East Coast and they translated the Bible from English into Hawaiian. They returned back to Hawaii, became missionaries in that space. And the Hawaiian language was written down for the first time. The kings required universal literacy, so Hawaii was the most literate society probably ever at the time. What are they reading? Well, what they're reading are these newspapers that were developed, and they're not newspapers like we have, like the Chronicle or the Mercury. These are newspapers that were locally created from printing presses around the islands, and they didn't record events necessarily. They recorded the history of those specific places. So the newspapers became this kind of repository of information about the past. However, by the 1990s, a lot of anthropologists, Hawaiian people, were lamenting the loss of language that was going to disappear. And there was a kind of a story that circulated that language is dead. There's no more people speaking Native Hawaiian languages. And it wasn't true. So Kamehameha Schools owns all this, what used to be the royal lands in Hawaii. The queen, Princess Puani, was able to create a trust called the Bishop Estate to educate Hawaiian youth. And all the royal lands were turned over to this trust. The trust has all of these archaeological sites, all the cultural patrimony, all the spaces that Native Hawaiian people could be accessing at the time or now today. However, the mission of the trust was is troubled. So you can look up, there's a good book called Trust, I forget the name of it, but I'll remember it by the end. And it's about the Kamehameha Schools crisis. What happened is that Native Hawaiian people said it's just become this corporation that's kind of corrupt, and it's not really serving the interests of Native people in Hawaii. So they instituted a cultural revitalization program, or revival program, where they started to train young people to speak Hawaiian, to read Hawaiian. So they opened up these newspapers, and when they did so, all those stories came back to life. And you had a whole generation of young people like Noea, this student I had, who were very interested in re-inscribing these landscapes using Hawaiian concepts, using Hawaiian history. And that's where we landed in 2023, this past year, and about 10 years ago. So we started to work with these communities. Access to archaeological sites is a big issue for all field schools and every kind of program. I think the biggest hurdle most people worry about is, can we get access? How do we get access to these places? Shortly after that is, what does the community think of the work that we're doing here? So one kind of phenomenon that's happened in Hawaii is that there is a whole generation of young people who are kind of ecological activists who are trying to reclaim these spaces from development or monocrop use. And a kind of interesting parallel, 1990 was when this revitalization movement started. It also represents the closing of the sugarcane economy in Hawaii. So the sugarcane economy collapsed for about 150 years. It was there. All of a sudden, the sugarcane production moves to Central America elsewhere. Corn syrup and things like that are more important. So you have massive areas that were used for sugarcane production that are abandoned. And these fires that we just heard about in Hawaii are not directly, but certainly the result of invasive grasses taking over these former agricultural spaces and creating fire hazards. Where there aren't native grasses, there are eucalyptus groves that are incredibly flammable that were planted as biofuel by these landowners. So Native Hawaiian people are not only learning about these spaces, but they're also rediscovering the technologies that fed people on the island. which is fascinating. Hawaii probably had one of the largest concentrations of people anywhere in the Pacific. Between 250,000 and 1 million people lived in those islands when Cook arrived in the 1700s, late 1700s. And the question we have as archaeologists say, how'd you feed those people? How did they get fed? So archaeology has a specific role to play in that we can come to these places and kind of record agricultural fields and how they worked, or trying to understand how Native people used these fish ponds to feed themselves. So archaeology has an application, and the connection is how do we get invited into those spaces? And the answer is participatory research. What do you offer? When we come to the spaces, we're asked, we don't set the agenda in terms of the research. We ask people, what do you need done? And what we find is that, oh, here we go. So this is the last summer. There's Sam right jumping up in the air. Right, and this is the fish pond. So we had two main locations, probably 3 or 4 also other ones. But we were looking at different sites around the island where different kinds of activities were undertaken. So all the islands were created, were kind of partitioned into these different districts. The districts were broken down into these other slim land holdings that go from the top of the volcano into the ocean, little pie-shaped things. They're not pie-shaped, that's how we imagine them. And each one of those districts had a management system within it. And what we can do is kind of understand how that worked by using archaeology, using techniques to record the things that are on the ground. So the fish ponds are one. It's a giant refrigerator, a place for fish hatcheries to take place. This is a large one, several acres. I think it's about 10 acres, massive. They're all around the islands, and they provided the protein needed to feed these large populations. Upland are these large tracts of land that either have ulu or breadfruit, which is a main staple of the Hawaiian diet. You have kalo, which is taro root in these lowlands. And you also have sweet potatoes that come from the Americas. So all those things fed people. And when colonization happened, those systems were kind of outlawed. So that literate society that we talked about kind of disappeared. And what was known as the genius of Hawaiian culture to feed people in those spaces became portrayed as kind of dumb and backward to people who were visiting those spaces. They kind of demolished that cultural knowledge.
And Native Hawaiians were taught to think it was dumb.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. So you'll talk to different generations of people, and they'll tell you like how they were instructed as little people, as younger people in school, especially the older folks, to never speak Hawaiian. It was like a forbidden thing, and we're kind of taught that it's stupid. The Hawaiian people were this is not my portrayal. It's how they would say they were portrayed by other people. It's kind of backwards. Like many indigenous peoples are portrayed this way. So how does this field school, how is it different? When we go to those spaces, we had access to these places. Our currency is we provide labor for projects that they want to have done in exchange for knowledge and teaching. So they'll teach us about those places. This is a famous valley called Waipio Valley on the Big Island of Hawaii. It's where one of the main figures in Hawaiian politics, a person named Umi Aliloa, who's kind of the person who brought the Hawaiian island of Hawaii together, and was famous for feeding people with these technologies he developed. And this is where he was from. So we got to go work in the fields surrounding Umi's homeland. And the other is at the Kolokohonokohau fish pond. This is just south of the airport in Kona. You probably wouldn't even know that it's there, but it's the main area for fish production for that part of Kona, that major part of the island. So what do? We usually go back here. So we start with the protocol every morning. Every time we enter into the space, we have to engage that space according to the traditions and protocols of that particular group of people. So it begins with a chant. The day begins with a chant where you acknowledge ancestors who are there, seen and unseen. You have to prepare yourself to enter into those spaces so that you're respectful. Our language is different. We are not, we tell students, you swear. We don't want you to use profanity, no filming unless there's permission. But it's a way to kind of change your mindset. And as we go into the spaces, we're kind of instructed through language, song, ceremony to enter it with a different kind of mindset than if I were just an archaeologist wandering into the space, trying to use my tools to understand that space. I wouldn't get what I can get without talking to people. So we're removing pickleweed from the area, the invasive grasses from the outside. And the way the fish ponds work is it rains up in the volcano and the mountains, and all that fresh water comes underneath the lava fields and goes out into the ocean, into that brackish area right there, which is incredibly productive for fish. So that's what the genius of that society is, that they figured out this blending of water. And what we're doing here is removing the mud and silt from these springs that would refresh that fish pond. So we're trying to reestablish understand how the fish pond worked and reestablish the biological viability of that space. So yeah, we just do pickleweed removal. We map walls where we can. We look for archaeological features, and we talk story, which is a way of that Hawaiian people, it's a term Hawaiian people use to talk about exchanges, informal exchanges that are not, very informative in many spaces and really important for getting to know folks. And we're pulling away all this mud, and as we do so, we're uncovering walls and features that are there, and really understanding really the beauty of this system. And then Vaihu. Vaihu is the release of water that's been traveling sometimes for 30 or 40 years from these big volcanoes where the rain has fallen, very slowly makes its way into the ocean, and it takes a long time. So we're actually opening these up, and it's like a spiritual moment for people who have been managing those fish ponds, that they have the help.
And yeah, Loke said, Vaihu.
Vaihu, yeah, it was like a really a blessing that was
and that's
happening.
Fish there. You can see that. So immediately once the water gets, we have exposed these springs, these fish just come right to it. Yeah. And then you can just see them just so happy and it's thriving, like, and it's immediate. Because all the students are like, whoa. Yeah. And then the Loke, the Hawaiian we're working with, says, Vaihu, which means water bursting forth in their language. And so that's like, it all sort of comes together when those moments take place, which are happening all day when you're doing this.
So the connection is personal. So with that, the guy, the O'Connor Castle, that's his castle in his imagination, in his mind. In our minds, that's his castle. This particular place is managed by families who lived in those villages along the ocean before colonization took place, and even during colonization. And they manage these spaces. They're volunteers. No one's telling them to do this. They're doing it on their own. So you have in Hawaii a really interesting thing, which is that people are claiming their archaeology, their cultural patrimony in a really different way. And I wouldn't have access to that if I hadn't spoken to people. I wouldn't know how that fish pond was functioned. Or the fact that the reason why we can't excavate in that place is because there are elite or royal people, perhaps Kamehameha, who's buried in that space, and the burials are very important. So we are able to understand the specific context and value of that place. Now, we're restoring the fish pond, but you're going to see that we're also changing the communities that we're in, right? So we didn't manufacture this or try and have it happen, but we see something happening when we are allowed to bring students into these spaces. When they start talking to people, something changes, and a new kind of archaeology emerges from that. And that's the magic we want to bring to your attention. So there's just some walls that we found. Hui Mau is a nonprofit. That student who I mentored when he was at Stanford went back home, got a degree from Hawaiian political science from UH, and he started this nonprofit called Hui Mau that educates people about language, about culture, about umi, about the history of Hawaii, without a colonial focus. We don't talk about Captain Cook. It's about the genius of that place. Just to give you a sense of the urgency of feeding people. Hawaii has a 10-day supply of food, right? That's about it. So the Costco runs out after about 10 days. The ships stopped coming and there's no food left. So the stuff that's happening in Hawaii, that we're seeing now, the crisis of tourism, the shift away from sugarcane to tourism-based economy, we're seeing these things happen in real time. We're seeing how communities are responding to these threats and these things happening. Okay, so what does Hui Mau do? It does a lot of things that the state, that tribes should be doing, but they don't have the capacity to do so. So what do? They have land holdings that they're using, reclaiming as former sugarcane fields. They're removing the eucalyptus groves and planting food to feed people, which is amazing. If you go to a store in Honokaa where we work, a loaf of bread is $14, and it's not a fancy Dave's loaf of bread. It's a freaking little loaf of bread.
Wonder bread.
And they make about 15, 16 bucks an hour at the resorts. So there's a problem. So it's not just archaeology, but once you start these conversations, you're exposed to all these other different aspects of society that we would never have gotten access to. So what do we do? What do we contribute? Well, we help them rebuild this wall to protect this field system in this one area at Hui Mau. We didn't know what we were doing. We just said to go down into the gulch, bring up some rocks.
We created this big line, and there was 30 of us, and we passed.
Big line, passing rocks. Stones, right? And
it was the highlight of the students' month.
Who knows why? I have no idea. I really enjoyed it because we're doing what the activities, we're engaging in the activities that constructed these giant heiaus or temples in Hawaii. The day before, we had seen this large one called Pu'ukohala Heiau, and that's the main temple from which Kamehameha launched his conquest of the other islands. And you can see this massive stone structure. The next day we went out and we tried to figure out how that happened. We used the techniques of Hawaiian people to reconstruct this one wall. So it's pretty amazing. This is taro or kalo fields that are in Hawaii. You might put it in the basket of say experimental archaeology or middle range theory, if you want to talk about that kind of a thing, where we're trying to understand directly how people interacted with these spaces today, still too, and how they worked. And this is we're standing in the middle of one of these eucalyptus groves that's been cleared out. So Huimau, all these different groups that we're working with are approaching the past and heritage from a completely different perspective. Like, it's not just the site or the beautiful artifacts, it's the way that these engagements, the stories that we're able to tell, transform communities in different ways that we're not expecting. So we don't want to sound like we're like savior anthropologists. It's not what's happening. We didn't plan any of this. We just noticed that when we're in these spaces, we offer these things, a different kind of thing is happening that's really interesting for us. This is a field system up in a big mountain. We're sitting there looking down at this big Kohala field system that went for probably about 20 miles. Massive grid system of where breadfruit was grown, feeding all those hundreds of thousands of people. And what we're doing here is we're trying to figure out how these field systems work. So we're reconstructing these walls. We're planting plants. This is Pu'unui, where they've been doing this kind of work for a long time. So they're experimenting with different kinds of regimes of plants and things to figure out how this worked. Now, what you'll see here is like cattle has completely denuded what was probably a dryland forest, right? So the cows are still there eating the little shoots. If we took the cows away, you'd see it turn into a forest again. We're not quite there yet. Now here we're learning about the archaeology of that area, but we're also instructing the members of the community on how to do their own archaeology. So we're kind of helping them to record these spaces using their own knowledge and knowledge of the land when they're there. Another beautiful shot of Waipio. And here, once again, we're clearing some, for the working in the kalo fields, what were we asked to do? We're asked to clear the weeds so they can start growing kalo. So you think, well, it's service, but really what you're doing is learning about how this system works. Because as we're working, they're talking about kalo, they're talking about the life cycle of the plant, its cosmology, its relationship to Hawaiian people. All of these stories happen only because we're there with a different set of expectations, I think. And then there's me telling a story. Oh, that's not me. Sorry, that's a joke between us. That's Bronson Palupe, who is he's in their calendar, the Huimau calendar. Every month you have a picture of Bronson. We're just joking. He's a really interesting guy who's been there for a long time, and he tells the story of Umi to these students. And I was transfixed. I'm over there on the right, because we wouldn't have this opportunity had we just been assuming the normal field school of just going to a place, trying to avoid talking to people, which is how I was trained. You don't want to don't talk to the native people over there because they're going to screw up our project, right? This is that's really true. But this is really a different kind of engagement. And we took this technique of community-based research, which is happening in California, but tried to apply it, in our own world. So who can we work with here? Well, Muwekma is one. Amamutsun is another. And up in Clear Lake, where Sam lives, is another group of people, the Pomo folks. So we started to do this archaeology, trying to involve Native people, and we have these great engagements that are happening. This is the chairwoman of Muwekma and her son, this Charlene Chairwoman Nijme from Muwekma, and all the Foothill students are there, and we're doing archaeology with them, this one space.
She came to Hawaii.
Oh, she came to, that's right. So we had Chairwoman Nijme come to Hawaii, and she was part of that Huimau, our field program over there. And this is kind of, well, you just want to take over from here?
No, that's kind of that's it. We're just rolling into the last bit.
Okay.
And so locally in California, we have another field project starting in just a couple of weeks. And I just wanted to highlight for students, if anybody's out there and you want to take part, quite a few people come over from Santa Cruz to take part. And this is in a place called Hidden Villa, which is right behind Foothill College. And the students there are, again, feeling more that this is beyond just learning the techniques. They're doing some sort of project where they have been asked to be there. working with this local nonprofit who's interested. It's their 100th anniversary of Hidden Villa. Hidden Villa was famous, doing some radar there, which is famous because the Duveneck family housed Cesar Chavez. They were the first biracial or interracial summer camp in the entire of all of California. So it's had a lot of, in terms of equity and kind of the stories we want to tell. It's a very important place locally in the South Bay. And so their 100th anniversary is upcoming, and they asked us to go in there and find out a little bit about the history, maybe find some remnants of some earlier construction, and that's what we've been doing. There's earlier cabin structures that we're looking for. We're going to be there doing some survey and some testing on that for them. There's the group from last fall, and then we also go over to Stanford, where Mike's trying to do the same thing that you're doing in Hawaii, right? With the native garden there, in which so the students are there and they help with the planting of native plants in that area. So Mike, did you want to share a bit about that, or we're good?
No, we're good.
Okay, and so this is near Jasper Ridge, the Alpine exit, basically Alpine Road exit off of the 280. Right there is where you've got this Stanford sort of allotted some space for a native garden. So those same stories then could be told here with folks from the area, and that would be the idea going forward. And that's kind of it for that. If anybody had questions on sort of any of those projects, how they're all interconnected and how we're kind of thinking of them, we're trying to make sense of that as well. So if you have any comments or questions, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you.
It's a lot, I know.
Check and see if we have questions.
Is there anybody left on that?
Too.
We did good. We did it. It was an hour. That was good.
Oh, good. Yeah, see, is there anybody in the chat?
If anybody has questions, let us know. I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay.
I don't know how to stop. I think I stopped sharing. Hey, Brooke, how are you?
All right, well. Fascinating.
Oh, Maya's there too. Hello, everybody. There are people I know there.
It's like bringing the culture back into cultural, right? Really, doing the work of cultural anthropology as well as archaeology, closing the gap between, us and them, and, working together. And I think that's just
I have a
really.
question.
Yeah.
So in Hawaii, when you guys are working with the folks with their native foodways, now, is it gotten to the point where some of these indigenous foods are now being available like in stores and stuff for people to
Certainly.
purchase, and
The
they're
students
bringing
are-
it back into their regular diet?
Yeah, the students were really interested in kava. They were drinking a lot of that. That's a native drink, which is
Yeah, it's weird.
semi-stimulant.
The
Which is now being sold in many,
I think it's
a
for
couple
sale
places.
here.
But for sale here too.
So,
Like
yeah, the question
coffee
is-
in the morning, or?
It's something like that, but it's a ceremonial drink usually.
ceremonial
I want to say, so the connection back to start off talking about crisis for indigenous people. What are they? It's food systems
Right,
and climate
right.
change. So the Hawaii project is about that specifically. We're trying to understand how these technologies were used in the past to feed people. So yeah, do people eat breadfruit? Yes. That particular farm will probably be the largest breadfruit farm on the islands, and it may not be popular here, but it's a main staple. It's kind of like a potato and an apple and a pineapple. I don't know how to explain it, but it's a very nutrient dense food. Kalo is another one. You can buy that in any store. Kalua, which is the pig that you can buy the roasted pig, is another staple people use. But very slowly, people are trying to kind of relearn how to use these foods and recipes and things like that. But look, it's a food desert, right? I'm not kidding about that. The $12 loaf of bread, that's a food desert. It means that you can't get good quality food. Now, why? Why is that happening? Because a lot of the land that has been used to grow food produces food for the resorts, which is why so all that great food that can be grown in those spaces is going for sale somewhere else. Or
Fancy
to someone
restaurants.
else. Fancy restaurants. So the price of food is it's like shopping in an airport, really. You just go, what? This is nuts. It's $20 for a sandwich. That's what is happening there. So there is an immediacy to it's not just a nice thing where we're trying to understand how the food system works. No, like if we start this conversation about sustainability in Hawaii, maybe we can move things a little bit over towards trying to remanage these spaces, these landscapes in a different way. So monocrops, all the money goes away, and reclaiming those spaces means feeding people with those spaces. So what I think we're discovering is that when we do this kind of work, all these different things, these parts of a society that we're not aware of, open up as interesting things that are connected to this past in a way that I don't think I'd get at if I was looking at, say, pottery style changes on the mesa, which is something people do, and it's interesting, it's useful. But the big picture stuff only comes, I think, from talking to people about those impacts. Hey, Brooke.
I have a question about your field school in Ecuador. I think that's the one that you said you needed to make smaller, and could you just explain what the limitations were? And are you thinking of taking other fields in anthropology there as well, since you're doing that type of cultural work?
I think that, I mean, you've hit upon it, that you as well, that it's very fluid now. I mean, I think that those subfields, the 4 subfields that you would learn in kind of a basic anthropology class are really overlapping now. Yeah. And I would think that would be a strong yes. And that even within the AIA website where we're advertising the Archaeology Field Opportunities Bulletin, AFOB, nobody's calling me up and saying, "Oh, this isn't really archaeology." Because of that, I think there's a lot of overlap that definitely can happen. In Hawaii, we had an entire day where it was dedicated to doing ethnography, where they sat and they interviewed people elders who had worked on the plantations, on the sugar plantations like 40, 50, 60 years ago. And they were sharing. And they got out of this one guy that he was kind of they're part of this early huelga. What's huelga?
Like a labor movement?
The labor movement, sort of a labor strike. The Filipinos were striking in the sugar plantations, and he was one of the guys involved with that. That's the same. Those are the same people who then the ideas were taken by people working here in California for their strikes. So that was, I mean, students were kind of eliciting that information, which was neat. And then thinking about sort of how that would tie to a project if you're going to do a historical archaeological project in that area on plantation, sugar plantations through time, something like that. And so there's so much overlap, I think. I think you're right on. And then in Ecuador, to reduce the size, yes, you would do that, because I think in Ecuador, what we'll have to do is take small groups that can maybe, some who are interested in maybe doing lab work, and then overlapping that with doing interviews and working with local communities. There's a lot of legwork. So talking to these communities in Hawaii, Mike's been going there for 15 years talking to them. So it's not, you're just not showing up, right? It's a lot of background communication, spending time there that I think needs to happen. And that's why I was thinking about reducing size and then more interviewing and just spending time with people, finding the right connections where you can really make, really kind of see this come to fruition. Yeah. But so far behind there, I think, in respect to those ideas. And that's, I think, the story here was that you had the Ecuador, which is way behind. You had sort of Hawaii, where you're sort of, it's happening and it's in front of you. And then in Ireland, it's sort of already happened, maybe. I don't know. Like, that's, I'm trying to understand what's going on in Hawaii as we're led along, as we're led from cultural event to cultural event by the Irish. So, and making sense of all of that, and then analyzing, having the students understand their positionality within those spaces, that's really important, because then they're understanding what their role is within there. And in Hawaii, it was amazing. As soon as we went and did a real tourist, like an actual tourist thing, the students were all like, whoa, this is so, I mean, they were like, they couldn't even do real tourism anymore, because they were just like, whoa, I feel like an imposter here. What is this? And so, and then their conversations after that were just incredible. So that's the kind of thing you're trying to get out of this situation. Yeah. Cool. Anybody else?
Any more questions?
Uh-oh,
Yeah, let me-
somebody's raising their hand. Go ahead.
Oh, good.
Great.
I don't have to raise my hand. I
Yeah, I
raised.
hear you.
You
How
saw
am I
my
gonna hear you? Sorry, Kathy. Yeah.
gonna-
How do we hear Kathy?
Oh,
What's
hi,
that,
I've got
Kathy?
you. I've done, uh,
Carla, hello.
Actually, can you write it?
Can you type it,
Type
Kathy?
it.
We can't hear you. Sign language.
you can't hear me.
Hybrid meeting where-
Sorry, we can't hear you, Kathy. We don't have sound. So
I should
that's
have
it.
sound.
Should we just say goodbye then?
We could, yeah, and if you have questions, email them to us and we'll.
Or type them in the chat if you had it, Kathy, if you wanted to do it
Six
quick.
new messages.
Oh, I can go down, Kathy. Oh, here we go.
We can see both slides now.
I'm gonna leave.
Okay.
We love you, okay. Yeah. Where can we find details?
Okay,
Thank you, okay.
Okay,
Anybody-
details, Anthropology, Foothill College Anthropology. You can find all the details for next year. Oh, and Kathy took off and then she's trying to come back with sound maybe.
Oops, what happened?
Okay,
Anyway, we only have a few more minutes in this room too, so, and we have to still clean up, so maybe we'll.
Thank you,
just,
everybody.
Say thank you and
Bye.
goodbye.
mention next
Oh, and
month.
Pat, can you tell us about next month?
So next month is, October, of course, and it's Archaeology Month. And, we are going to, host a tribute to Rob Edwards, who we lost in May, our founder, and a very special man. And, you know, he is also responsible for many of us being in archaeology. So,